Mirror's Edge was one of the most unique standout games that came out at the end of 2008. A parkour simulator that was exclusively done from a first-person perspective, it offered a different gameplay approach that was distinct among its FPS brethren, especially in the late 2000s. With the exception of a few games that also shifted their focus away from the shooting aspect, the focus of Mirror's Edge was specifically on its platforming gameplay, utilizing parkour elements and movement as the basis for the game's design. It was highly praised for its gameplay, allowing the player to maneuver environments and tackling the parkour aspects in a variety of different ways, while also giving them the added benefit of motion sickness. It was also notable for having a distinct graphical style with its contrasting colors and its use of light mode. While we did see a second game, one that was met with mixed reception, the franchise only got to see two main games before pretty much fading into the sunset. But the legacy of Mirror's Edge would not be forgotten. Despite the fact that we may never see another game again, we definitely saw a multitude of different games that carried on some of its influence. Titanfall not only employs the use of mechs in its gameplay, but uses parkour mechanics, allowing pilots to maneuver the environment for fast-paced combat and go toe-to-toe with titans. Dying Light employs parkour elements in order to maneuver around and combat hordes of zombies, making slaying the undead much more fun and gritty. Even games like Doom Eternal, while not completely employing parkour elements, added things like clambering and monkey bars to give more movement options to Doomguy's arsenal. Good use of the muscles, Doomguy. Though it's most likely dead in the water, the influence of Mirror's Edge can be found in many of the FPS games that came after it. But how does Mirror's Edge feel in this day and age? While we haven't gotten a dedicated parkour FPS game outside of its sequel, at least that I know of, we have gotten a number of FPS games whose parkour elements are integrated into their game's mechanics. Ghost Runner, a cyberpunk FPS platformer, heavily utilizes parkour in its core gameplay loop in order to traverse levels and allow the player to close the distance and assassinate enemies. The single-player portion of Titanfall 2 pretty much demands that you master its wall running and sliding techniques in order to complete certain levels. Outside of any specific game, nearly every fast-paced FPS has some type of sliding mechanic integrated into its core gameplay. So yes, there are a number of games that elevate and complement the FPS parkour experience that Mirror's Edge started for itself. But, as a dedicated FPS parkour game that's all about the more grounded running, jumping, climbing, dying, does it still feel good to play 15 years later? Let's take a look. So when you first start the game on Steam, you immediately have to fix it. If you're trying to get this game started but it doesn't work, you have to go to Mirror's Edge in your Steam Common Apps folder, go to this folder, then this folder, copy this file, then paste it back into this folder, and hopefully it works. I have no idea why, but thank you Steam forums. To anyone else, hopefully this is the only issue that you get, otherwise good luck to you and hope you get your problems fixed. Okay, back to the game. I think the first thing that pretty much always catches everyone's eye when they first start Mirror's Edge is its aesthetics. The high contrast color scheme is reflected in pretty much every aspect of the game. Its levels, its menus, the loading screen, even the box art itself reflects the thematic colors. When you do enter the game, it is immediately noticeable how much color contrast is expressed in the rooftops of the city. Buildings look so pristinely white and immaculate that you can't help but wonder just how good the janitorial departments are in this world.
Nice.
Even though this game came out at the end of 2008, from the outset, it sometimes doesn't feel like it did. The high contrast colors cleverly mask its older graphical architecture, making the environments feel bright and colorful. Rooftop landscapes look sleek, and the contrast of white with blues, reds, and even orange make the landscape pop out. This also extends to some of the offices and building interiors as well, with a myriad of different colors to complement the overwhelming shade of white in the architecture and furnishings. The graphical design of the environments and landscapes are easily one of the strongest points of Mirror's Edge. Though when you do look at some of the finer details, the age does start to show. In parts of the environment, some of the shadowing and scuff details aren't as naturally placed and they kind of look like they're layered on. In characters, facial models look a bit blocky and some of the skin textures look a little rough. You can even see it in the hand models of Faith as well whenever she raises her arms. Even the hair textures look very clay-like, with none of the modern graphical fidelity that would make it look more realistic. With that said though, for a late 2008 game, I still think it looks impressive even today. The distinctive high contrast colors do well to give the game its look, and it's very difficult to ignore that fact. The core gameplay aspect is pretty much the other highlight of Mirror's Edge. You traverse the environments trying to get from point A to point B in parkour fashion. Faith has the ability to utilize a couple of different methods to get to her destination, from climbing obstacles taller than her, climbing pipes, jumping across wide gaps, wall running, sliding under obstacles, returning to her starting position by falling off a building. Her movement options are varied enough that parkouring always feels fun and fast-paced. When it comes to the roof sections, I felt like maybe there could have been a little more parkour routes that the game could have added, but the overall options were adequate nonetheless. On the interior side of things, Faith will run across offices, sewers, and the back rooms to get to her destination. They were often linear in their routes, but some of them can be a little obtuse in their pathing, and you sort of have to figure out the correct way to go. It can be a bit of a trial and error, especially when there are enemies involved trying to kill you, but you can always use the guide button to help you with your pathing. Just be careful not to use it haphazardly. I think the main gripes have to be with the ledges. There were a number of times that Faith couldn't cling to them, even though I was within arm's reach. This has a lot to do with the angle of approach, as well as the distance, which felt inconsistent at times, and it sort of interrupted the flow of the gameplay. Despite this, once I kept them in mind, I was able to get a proper feel for the game and platform as normal. Combat is another portion of gameplay that Faith can utilize. She can use CQC in a number of different ways to defeat the enemies she comes across. From a flurry of punches to knock them out, jumping and slide kicking, counters to disarm enemies and deal more damage, or gun. Enemies are pretty tough in this game since they use a myriad of different firearms to hurt Faith from a distance, so she has to find the safest ways to close the gap and defeat them. In some instances, you can simply outrun them, but there are sections where it's pretty much required to fight them. While I would prefer the former method, fighting was manageable for the most part. Faith's agileness and disarming enemies always felt like a challenge when trying to dodge gunfire and close the gap. Though in levels where they're coming from every corner, it was a bit overwhelming to deal with, and I had to basically just play a waiting game and take them out one by one. When I eventually lost patience, well, I just used gun. I'd say the combat is serviceable, but not something I'd rave about. It always felt like it sort of interrupted the pace of the game, making Faith stand still more than running. I think if the combat felt more seamless with the parkouring aspects rather than feeling like a slugfest sometimes, it might have been more interesting. Story-wise, if I had to explain it, it basically goes like this. 1984-style totalitarian regime that likes to keep things clean, oppresses and runs the city to the point of a flawless, sterilized society. Citizens who oppose the regime depend on runners like Faith to operate outside of the regime's eye. Up-and-coming political candidate who opposes said regime is assassinated and Faith's sister is framed. Faith becomes the protagonist in her own anime, and she has to save the day. 100 words or less. Nice. The story of Mirror's Edge is, well, a story, and while it's not going to win any awards in my book, it's at least serviceable with giving a reason as to why we have to run on rooftops and do some cool parkour tricks. The writing with the characters is okay. Pretty much all of them are very one-dimensional. You have the mentor, the plastic friend, the rude asshole, the questionable cop, the musclehead, and the plot device. Faith herself is kind of written one-dimensionally as well, and it was a little hard for me to really care about her story and the world she's in, which is a shame because the voice actors actually did a pretty good job with giving these characters their personalities. The one thing that I do appreciate is some of the small world building that the game tries to give, especially with the news reports that you see while waiting in the elevator. On the sound front, everything sounds appropriate to Mirror's Edge. The effects ranging from the footsteps of Faith, the gunshots, to the much louder explosions all sound very appropriate and natural with nothing out of place. I think the one thing that I have to praise the sound team for is the ambient sound of the city. It's not quite loud and it's not very quiet either, which I think perfectly encapsulates what the rooftop sounds of a city would feel like. You get a mix of traffic noises, wind, generators coming from the rooftops, and even the occasional airplane passing by, all within earshot, but still sounding very distant. I think this is by far the most appropriately rooftop-sounding landscape that I've ever heard, outside of maybe open-world games like Spider-Man, for example. The music is also pretty good, establishing and setting up the mood of the situation when needed. From the simple futuristic sounds of the menu, upbeat music to heighten the tension of being chased,
Should be an exit off the rail overpass.
all of it well placed and appropriate for every single setting. So after finally playing Mirror's Edge again, despite its short campaign taking me roughly 4 hours to complete in a single day, I still found it enjoyable to traverse the cityscape. Even though it goes for the more realistic approach and is a bit slower by comparison to games like Titanfall and Ghost Runner, the feeling of running and maneuvering still felt like an experience that only I could see through Faith's gameplay. I think it's that sense of realism that gives Mirrors its edge over some of the games that came after it. Moving, jumping, and wall running obviously feels like it's restricted by real-world gravity, and Faith herself plays like a very human character. But I think that's exactly what makes it fun. Whether or not that appeals to you, I think is also up to personal taste. I can understand if some players don't want to be restricted by that sense of realism and would rather opt for the more unrestricted sense of freedom and movement that some games may offer. But, as far as I can tell though, outside of maybe its sequel, there isn't really any other title that feels like it has the same level of groundedness as Mirror's Edge, unless I'm missing some indie title that completely went over my head. Please enlighten me if I'm missing something here. But if you're willing to work with some of its design flaws, I'd say Mirror's Edge still holds up, just enough to make it still feel unique, even among similar titles that came after it. And that's gonna do it for today, guys. Thank you all for giving me a listen, and I'll see you all next time.